Have you ever stopped to think if the history we all learned in school was the whole story? Well, today we're diving into the core ideas of a book that asks that exact question, and it's sparked decades of debate. It's Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Now, our goal here isn't to convince you of anything, but simply to understand the powerful and, pretty controversial perspective it offers. This quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of Zinn's whole argument. He's challenging the very notion of a unified national interest. He suggests that when we tell the history of a country like it's one big happy family, we're covering something up. That something is the constant, often brutal conflict between different groups, between the rich and the poor, masters and slaves, conquerors and the conquered. So what does that actually look like in practice? I think this slide makes it super clear. On one side, you have traditional history. That's the story of the big names, right? The presidents, the generals, the leaders. It's told from the top down. Zinn's whole project was to flip that script completely, to tell the story from the bottom up, focusing on the people who are usually just footnotes in the main story. Okay, to really wrap our heads around this, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by really nailing down this different point of view. Then we'll see how Zinn applies it to the founding of the U.S. and to the whole idea of progress. After that, we'll get into the history of resistance that he uncovers. And finally, we'll ask the big question, why does any of this matter? All right, first up, this different point of view. Zinn starts with a really fundamental question. Whose story are we usually told? He argues that what we often call history is actually the memory of the state, basically the official version. And that version, he says, is almost always written from the perspective of the winners, the people in power who have a vested interest in us seeing the past in a certain way. So this is a really crucial point. A people's history isn't about, just adding a few new characters to the same old story. It's about reframing the entire narrative around conflict. It sees history as this constant tug of war between those with power and those without. And in that struggle, Zinn is very clear about where he stands. He believes a historian can't be neutral. They shouldn't side with what he calls the executioners. Okay, so let's put this idea to the test. Let's take one of the most celebrated moments in the American story, the Revolution. Through this lens, Zinn asks us to step back and ask a pretty tough question. Was the war for independence really fought for the interests of everybody living in the colonies? And he backs this up with some pretty eye-opening data. When the new states were forming their governments, they weren't always as democratic as you might think. Just look at Maryland. To even hold office, you had to own a certain amount of property. And those requirements were so high that a whopping 90% of the population was shut out. For Zinn, this is Exhibit A for a deep class divide right at the nation's founding. This slide just lays it all out, right? Zinn's whole point about these clashing interests. Sure, you had the founding fathers, many of them very wealthy, who wanted a stable government to protect their property. Makes sense. But what did other people want? Enslaved people wanted actual freedom. Poor soldiers wanted to get paid for fighting the war. Native Americans wanted to stop the colonists from taking more and more of their land. See? These interests weren't just different. Zinn argues they were fundamentally opposed to each other. And these conflicts didn't just magically disappear after the British were defeated. Not at all. Zinn points to events like Shays' Rebellion as proof. This was literally an armed uprising. You had war veterans and farmers in Massachusetts fighting against the new American elite because their farms were being taken away. They felt completely betrayed. For Zinn, this is just a crystal clear example of that ongoing class conflict. Now, Zinn takes this same lens and applies it to another core American idea, progress. You know the stories of westward expansion, manifest destiny, industrial growth. They're epic. But from Zinn's perspective, they look very different. He wants us to hit the brakes and ask a simple question. Who paid the price for all this so-called progress? To really grasp the scale of the human cost, Zinn starts way back, before the U.S. was even a thing. In 1492, the estimated native population in North America was around 10 million people. It's so critical to remember these weren't empty lands. They were home to hundreds of complex, thriving societies. And then, look at this number. By the late 1800s, after centuries of disease, war, and forced removal, that population of 10 million had collapsed to less than 1 million. Zinn's argument is that this wasn't just some unfortunate side effect of expansion, it was the direct result of deliberate policies. And so he asked the question, can you really call it progress when this is the cost? Zinn highlights another just staggering price paid for economic progress, the slave trade that fueled the entire colonial economy. The journey itself, the Middle Passage, was so horrific that on some voyages, 1 out of every 3 captive Africans died before even reaching the Americas. Zinn includes an account that described a slave deck as being so covered in blood and mucus that it, quote, resembled a slaughterhouse. This unbelievable suffering, he points out, was the foundation for immense wealth. But, and this is a huge but, Zinn's history is not just a catalog of oppression. That's not the point. The other half of the story, the part that's just as important, is the history of resistance. This is about the people who, against all odds, fought back, organized, and demanded a better world. Take the early feminist movement, for example. At the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, a group of women did something absolutely brilliant. They took the Declaration of Independence, a document that completely excluded them, and they rewrote it to demand their own rights. It's a perfect example of a marginalized group using the nation's own founding ideals to call out its hypocrisy. You see that exact same fire in the abolitionist movement. Zinn features figures like Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery to become this incredible, powerful voice against it. And Douglass really captured a core idea of a people's history with this quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. Freedom isn't just handed over, it has to be won. It requires a struggle." And this resistance popped up in all kinds of forms, even in culture. This is from a song by Joe Hill, a famous songwriter for a radical labor union called the Wobblies. It's just this sharp, funny, and deeply angry critique of telling workers to suffer now for a reward in the afterlife. It shows how art and music became weapons in the fight for workers' rights. Okay, so after looking at all of this, the conflict, the oppression, but also the incredible resistance, we land on the final and maybe the most important question. Why does any of this matter? What's the point of focusing on all the struggle instead of the unity? For Zinn, the answer is all about hope. It's about agency. He argues that if the only history you ever learn is about presidents and generals, it's pretty easy to become cynical, right? To think that change only ever comes from the top. But when you uncover this long, hidden tradition of popular movements, of ordinary people standing up and demanding change, it shows you something else. It shows you that change from the bottom up is possible. It reveals what he calls the possibility of surprise. And so we're left with this question, which is really the ultimate point of Zinn's work. It shifts the focus from the past directly onto us, right here, right now. If history isn't just something that happens to us, but something that we create with our choices, with our actions, or our inaction, then what kind of story are we writing for the future?